Live. It's a pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about when do we finally put down the stick. Now, what I'm talking about there is this, it's actually kind of a dark idea that when we beat ourselves up is different than when someone else beats us up. And the saying is that when someone else beats us up, they finally stop. But that means, of course, that when we're beating ourselves up, we may not ever stop. And I think if we're truly honest with ourselves, the sad fact is, when do we stop beating ourselves up? How many times can we go along that same rut, that same path, where we just keep beating ourselves up, just keep criticizing ourselves, telling ourselves that negative story about every action that we may have undertaken? And the thing about this is that we can do this forever, meaning we can do this timelessly. We can do this not just forever in terms of like it's something constant and eternal that we're doing in our minds today, but we can take virtually any moment of our past lives, no matter how many years back we're going, and go back in time to an incident that happened and find that element of self-criticism, find that element of self-rejection, of not giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt, of not giving ourselves a break, but instead being the judge and jury and prosecutor and even hangman for ourselves. Now, there are a couple reasons why we do this. One idea that I've actually been talking about in the past week with a number of people is the victim triangle. In the victim triangle, every triangle has three corners or three sides. There are always three elements. The most important element is the bottom element, the victim. And when we are beating ourselves up, we are the victim. We're the victim of our own emotional violence against ourselves. Now, when we're doing that, it's because we want the two other elements. We're bringing into play one other element of that victim triangle, the victim being the bottom corner. One of the corners is the perpetrator, right? Every victim needs a perpetrator. Somebody stole my car. I'm a victim of grand theft auto. Somebody had to be the person who stole the car. We are the victim of our own thoughts. We become our own perpetrators. Every negative internal message we're telling ourselves is the perpetration of a crime against ourselves. And lastly, the third element in this triangle, if there's a victim and there's a perpetrator, what do I want to do? My car got stolen. What do? I want to call the police because I want to be rescued. I want them to find my car. I want everything to be okay as it was before. That's what the rescuer can do. And so at a certain level, when we're trapped in this psychological refrain, this kind of psychological prison or negative merry-go-round of thinking, where we're beating ourselves up, we're the victim and we're the perpetrator simultaneously, I think at a certain level, maybe it's so far down we're not even aware of it, we're looking for somebody to rescue us. We're looking for somebody to come back to us and say, you know what, it's okay, Mark. It's not that bad, and actually you're a good person, and you did right. You did the best you could, and give us all of these positive messages that will enable us to stop the negative messages we've been telling ourselves. We want to get out of that cycle, and we're hoping somebody else can do it. Well, the truth is, we are really the only ones who can rescue ourselves. We're the only ones who can lift ourselves up out of that trap, out of that prison we set for ourselves. Now, how do we do it? In my experience, to be perfectly frank, it's a daily challenge. Sometimes it's an hourly challenge. Sometimes it's a minute-to-minute challenge. It's not like recovering from a broken arm. You break your arm, you're little boy, you fall out of you climb a tree, you fall out of the tree, you break an arm. Years later, it's grown back. Yeah, they can tell it's there on an x-ray. They'll see a little bit of a lump around, your bone grows a little thicker around the area where the break was. But in day-to-day life, you'll never know that it was broken. That's a form of internal self-healing. You never have to go back and re-heal that arm. Unfortunately, in our victimization, in our, taking up the stick and beating ourselves up, we can take up that stick any day, any time, any hour, any minute, over things that happened that we've already done this about, as I said before, for years. We can go back to something that happened 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, if we're old enough, and pick up that stick and go right back to it. So it's a daily reprieve that we're looking for from this incredibly painful merry-go-round that we put ourselves on. So the first thing that I've found in my experience that we have to accept is that there is no fix it for once and forever. It is actually a daily challenge to fix it. What has worked for me? My spiritual domain. I talk a lot about the Remarkable Men's Practice 10 domains, and you see them up there on the board. Right next to my 9 components of continual forward progress, the aspects that we need to engage when we want to move forward in our lives. But when we're looking at our whole life, in our internal life, the life that we want to move forward, we can examine it through these 10 domains. And it looks like my head was cut off while I did that. That was kind of funny. But anyway, you saw the 10 domains. And the one domain here towards the bottom, and I'll see if I can keep my head in the frame, is the spiritual domain. I've found that engaging my spiritual domain is my best tool against that negative self-image. And what do I mean about that spiritual domain? Well, the Remarkable Men's Practice talks about it as having multiple components: choice, faith, depth, connection, way, ground, gratitude, and authority. All of those are helping us connect to this spiritual aspect of our lives, this idea that there is something greater than ourselves, whether it is a higher power that is eternal, whether there is a natural world that we want to connect to in a sunset or in a beautiful view from a mountaintop that we've hiked up to, whether it's just the beauty of watching birds. We have some bird feeders that we put into our house, that we put into our backyard, and it's a pleasure to watch the birds eat their food and see that there is a life well beyond this sometimes petty life that we live as human beings, because we can get so caught up in these petty details. That's all a step out of our own mind. Another way of saying it is ego. When I'm wrapped up in beating myself up, what I'm really doing is I'm caught up in my own ego. Not in the sense of, look at me, I just won an Academy Award, I made $1 billion on Wall Street. No, it's ego of, I'm the most important thing, and my screw-ups are more important than anything else in the world. It's the negative ego. I'm not putting myself on the pedestal, I'm putting myself under the pedestal, but it's still an egoistic exercise. But there's a saying that when we say ego, we're edging God out. And so we can't be in spiritual connection and be so cruel to ourselves. For me, in my beliefs, that happens because there is, for me, a fundamental truth that I live with a piece of God inside me. And so when I'm beating myself up, as I do, sometimes on a daily basis, I'll be completely honest, I am actually betraying the divine spark within me, my divine nature. Whether it's eternal, whether there's life after death, whether we go on in a kind of karmic sense to live in other lifetimes to improve ourselves, I'm not going there. I'm not getting into that. But I'm saying that there is something holy, something sacred about my life itself, and that my higher power, which is a force outside myself and a force outside of nature, which I call God, has implanted this within me. And that if God has given me this spark within me, then I have a divine role to play on this planet. Whatever that divine role may be is good enough for God. And that divine role doesn't have to look the same for everybody. For some people, that divine role is massive wealth, massive power, massive esteem from their colleagues, or from the public, celebrity. Who knows what that looks like for every other person? But for me, it is divine for me to live my life the way I am living it. That is good enough for God. And even more, God wants me to go maybe even a step further. I'm getting into Peloton, and there's a particular teacher, Christine Durcole, that always talks about a hand on our backs. She wants us to think about her hand is on our back as we're doing our Peloton rides. And I want to say that that's a very divine and very beautiful sentiment, because we want God's hand to be on our back, and we want to feel it and we want to remember it. So when we're in that kind of pity party, when we're kind of beating ourselves up, we're forgetting to stop beating ourselves up. We are ignoring that divine hand. We're actually saying, forget that, get it away. I don't deserve it, I don't need it, which is really just another way of us to push ourselves further down in that victim triangle, deeper into our victimhood. So if we can remember that hand on our back, that divine spark that we have inside us, it gives us a moment, a break from the self-immolation, from the self-beating, to say, oh, wait a minute, maybe I don't need to do this. For me, I decided to find a particular phrase. It's from a psalm, from Psalm 118, because in my Jewish practice, that is my guideline to a spiritual connection. And it's the passage in Psalm 118 which says, Min ha-metzar karati ya anani bemrachav ya. In English, that means, from my narrowness, I called out to him, or her, or it, or God. I called out to God, to my higher power, and God answered me from his expansiveness, or from God's breadth. From my narrowness, I called out, and I was answered with breadth. I was answered with abundance. From my scarcity, I was granted abundance. If I can remember to say that, I can stop that cycle. I can I can drop the stick, at least for now. If I pick it up again, and I have that moment of divine inspiration, that spiritual awakening in the moment to remember, you know what? I'm feeling scarce. I need to call out, and I will be answered from the broadness, and I will be reminded of the gratitude, which was one of the spiritual components, which is one of the components of the spiritual domain. I can be grateful for what has gone right in my life, for what I have accomplished, for what I can do and what I'm able to do. And then I can kind of look back. That gives me now a step to say, you know what? I don't need to keep beating myself up for something that happened an hour ago, a day ago, a week ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. I can live in the present. I can be here in this moment. And now I start to feel a sense of peace. I feel a sense of release. Now, when we have made a mistake and we do need to clean it up, one of the things we have to be very careful about is to not use it to bring ourselves back into this cycle of beating ourselves up. So our apologies sometimes maybe the best thing to do is to figure out how to pay it forward. How do we not go back to the place? You know, if we're apologizing for always being late, isn't the real answer to just not be late anymore, to change, to figure out what's causing us to be late and make that adjustment? Isn't that the greatest apology we can give? And once again, it doesn't mean me berating myself or lowering myself to the other person and saying, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so imperfect. What if it's just saying, you know what, I am going to really work on this and I'm going to make it make my commitment to be different, to make a small change in my life. And again, if I connect to my spiritual domain and realize that there is some natural power greater than me and I'm worthy of it, I can now find the strength to make that change. So thank you for being with me today. Send me your comments. Check out my YouTube channel, Mark Rothman Progress Coach, and my website, markcoach.net, and I'll see you next week.